The story of Bashar al-Assad is, at its core, a story of unexpected destiny. Long before he became the president who would preside over the near-total destruction of his own country, Bashar was a young man living a life that seemed entirely detached from the corridors of ultimate political power in Damascus. To understand how he arrived at the apex of the Syrian state, one must look back at the dynastic ambitions of his father, Heir al-Assad, and the sudden, tragic twist of fate that violently rerouted the course of Syrian history. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Heir al-Assad, a former Air Force commander and defense minister, seized absolute control of Syria through a military coup, establishing the rule of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party and anchoring his regime in the minority Alawite sect. Over decades, Hafez built a rigidly authoritarian security state, crushing political opposition with ruthless efficiency and forging a personality cult that penetrated every facet of Syrian public life. Portraits of the elder Assad loomed over street corners, classrooms, and government offices, watching over a populace kept in check by a terrifying apparatus of secret police and military intelligence. Within this tightly controlled dynastic framework, Heir al-Assad had clear plans for succession. Power was meant to stay firmly within the family, passing from father to eldest son. That chosen heir was Bashar al-Assad. Basil was charismatic, athletic, and fiercely ambitious, the quintessential political prince groomed from youth to inherit his father's mantle. Basil was immersed in military academies, assigned high-profile anti-corruption tasks, and paraded before the public as the undisputed future leader of Syria. Every institutional signifier pointed to Basil as the next iron-fisted ruler of the republic. Bashar, by contrast, occupied a very different space within the family dynamic. Born in Damascus in September 1965, Bashar was quieter, more introverted, and visibly lacking the brash political confidence of his older brother. While Basil embraced the public spotlight, riding horses and driving fast cars, Bashar pursued a quieter, more academic path. He attended the elite Muhajirin school in Damascus and later enrolled at the Faculty of Medicine at Damascus University, focusing on ophthalmology. To those who knew the Assad family in the 1980s, Bashar appeared to be the intellectual spare rather than the political engine, a young man content to practice medicine rather than command battalions. In the early 1990s, Bashar moved to London to complete his postgraduate medical training at the Western Eye Hospital, specializing in eye diseases. In the British capital, he lived a relatively subdued life. Acquaintances from that period often described him as unassuming, soft-spoken, and deeply interested in computer technology and the internet, then in its nascent global expansion. He wore simple suits, drove an ordinary car, and showed little inclination toward the authoritarian brutality that characterized his father's regime. Friends and observers later recalled a man who seemed more comfortable discussing computer hardware or medical journals than military strategy or Ba'athist ideology. Yet, family destiny in an authoritarian dynasty is an inescapable cage. On January 21, 1994, the entire political architecture of Syria was shaken to its core. Driving his Mercedes at high speed through heavy fog on the road to the Damascus International Airport, Bashar al-Assad crashed and was killed instantly. He was only 31 years old. The sudden death of the golden boy Heir sent shockwaves through the Syrian political elite. The succession plan, painstakingly constructed by Heir al-Assad, lay shattered in the wreckage. Suddenly, Bashar was summoned from London. The quiet ophthalmologist found his comfortable, anonymous life in the British capital abruptly terminated by paternal decree. Upon his return to Damascus, Bashar was immediately thrust into a crash course in political survival and statecraft. The regime could not afford a vacuum at the top, and Heir al-Assad, aging and in declining health, needed an immediate replacement to secure the family's grip on power. The transition from doctor to dictator in training began almost overnight, setting in motion a sequence of events that would eventually burn a nation to the ground. The transition of Bashar al-Assad from a quiet, unassuming ophthalmologist residing in London to the designated political heir of the Syrian Republic was swift, calculated, and absolute. Following the tragic death of his older brother Basil in January 1994, the political machinery of the Ba'athist state ground into motion to rescue the dynastic succession plan. Bashar was summoned from his medical residency at the Western Eye Hospital in London, stripped of his quiet anonymity, and thrust into an intensive, compressed program of military and political indoctrination designed to transform him into a commander and a leader. Heir al-Assad and the inner circle of the regime could not leave the survival of the ruling family to chance, and thus began the systematic elevation of a man who had previously shown no ambition for statecraft. Upon his arrival back in Damascus, Bashar was immediately enrolled in the military academy at Homs. The military was the bedrock of the Assad regime, and any legitimate successor needed to command the absolute respect and obedience of the armed forces. Over the following years, Bashar was rapidly accelerated through military ranks in a manner designed to project authority and establish institutional credentials. He entered the military as a captain in 1994, moving swiftly to major in 1995, lieutenant colonel in 1997, and staff colonel by January 1999. He was assigned to elite military formations, taking command of a tank battalion and eventually assuming leadership roles within the Republican Guard, the specialized military wing tasked with protecting the regime from internal threats. Veteran military commanders loyal to the older generation were gradually retired or sidelined, making room for younger officers and establishing a network of personal loyalty directly tied to the new heir. Simultaneously, the regime orchestrated a massive public relations campaign to introduce this unfamiliar face to the Syrian public. State-controlled media, which had spent years glorifying Basil, pivoted overnight to build a new personality cult around Bashar. Billboards and posters featuring Hafez, Basil, and now Bashar appeared side by side across Damascus and every provincial city, captioned with slogans declaring them symbols of national pride and continuity. To build his domestic political standing, Bashar was placed at the head of high-profile bureaucratic institutions. He was appointed president of the Syrian Computer Society, a position that cleverly leveraged his technological interests to market him to the urban populace and technocrats as a modernizer, a reformer, and a man attuned to the digital age. He was also given charge of a state bureau handling public complaints and a high-profile anti-corruption campaign. This office allowed him to project an image of a clean, industrious administrator willing to challenge inefficiencies while simultaneously neutralizing potential political rivals by investigating them for corruption. Behind the carefully managed public appearances and military promotions lay a rigorous grooming process supervised directly by his ailing father and the entrenched security barons. Bashar was gradually introduced to complex regional files, most notably Lebanon, where Syrian intelligence and military hegemony had been deeply entrenched for decades. He met with foreign dignitaries, attended regional summits, and was slowly integrated into the shadowy world of Security Committee meetings, where the real power of the Syrian state resided. Yet, throughout this transition, observers noted a stark contrast between father and son. While Hafez exuded a cold, calculated, and intimidating aura built over decades of brutal political survival, Bashar often appeared stiff, cautious, and socially awkward, still retaining some of the reserved demeanor of a medical researcher. By the late 1990s, the transformation was officially codified. The reluctant doctor had been thoroughly recast as a military commander and political successor. The machinery of the Ba'ath Party, the loyalty of the Alawite-dominated officer corps, and the acquiescence of the economic elite had all been aligned to ensure that, when Hafez al-Assad's life eventually ended, the transition of power would face no institutional hurdles. The path from the quiet wards of a London hospital to the halls of the presidential palace in Damascus was complete, setting the stage for a new era of dynastic rule that would profoundly alter the destiny of the nation. On June 10, 2000, an era that had defined modern Syria for 3 decades came to an abrupt and monumental end. Heir al-Assad, the iron-fisted ruler who had shaped the country through meticulous control, brutal suppression of dissent, and calculated regional maneuvering, died of a heart attack while on the phone with Lebanese Prime Minister Salam al-Has. For 30 years, Hafez had anchored the Syrian state around his personal authority, building a pervasive security apparatus and an unyielding political dynasty. His passing instantly plunged the nation into a state of profound shock and uncertainty. Across Damascus, television broadcasts switched from regular programming to verses from the Quran, and a deep, apprehensive silence fell over the streets. The central question, echoing through diplomatic backchannels, military barracks, and ordinary living rooms, was simple yet terrifying. Could the Syrian state survive without its patriarch, or would the complex web of rivalries, sectarian balances, and security barons tear the country apart? The answer to that question had been meticulously engineered over the preceding 6 years, but the machinery of succession now had to move with lightning speed to prevent a power vacuum. Within hours of Hafez's death, the emergency mechanisms of the state swung into action. The high command of the armed forces, dominated by loyal Alawite generals and veteran intelligence chiefs, met in emergency session and declared their absolute allegiance to Bashar al-Assad. To clear the first and most significant legal hurdle for the young heir, the Syrian parliament hastily convened in an extraordinary session. Under the existing constitution, the president of the republic was required to be at least 40 years old. Bashar, who had been born in September 1965, was only 34. In a stunning display of institutional compliance and regime coordination, the parliament voted unanimously within hours to amend the constitutional age requirement for the presidency, lowering it precisely to 34 so that Bashar became immediately eligible. Simultaneously, the regional command of the ruling Ba'ath Party elected Bashar as its Secretary General, cementing his control over the political apparatus that governed public life and state institutions. With the legal and party hurdles swiftly cleared, the regime orchestrated a tightly controlled transition of power designed to project national unity and overwhelming popular mandate. The culmination of this process was the presidential referendum held in July 2000. In keeping with the political traditions of the Ba'athist state, there were no opposition candidates or competitive elections. Instead, the ballot presented voters with a single binary choice: to approve or reject Bashar al-Assad as the new president of the Syrian Arab Republic. State media saturated the airwaves, newspapers, and public squares with massive portraits of the new leader, pairing his image with that of his late father and his deceased brother Basil to emphasize continuity, lineage, and national stability. Security forces and party officials mobilized supporters to ensure a massive turnout, and when the results were officially announced, they conformed perfectly to the expected script. A staggering 99.7% of the participating electorate voted in favor of Bashar. On July 17, 2000, standing before the legislature and flanked by the country's most powerful military commanders, Bashar al-Assad took the constitutional oath of office, formally assuming the presidency and stepping fully into the immense shadow cast by his father. Yet, beneath the choreographed pageantry of the inauguration and the official reports of near-unanimous public support, Syrian society was experiencing a complex and contradictory wave of emotions. While regime insiders and loyalists breathed a sigh of relief at the smooth transfer of power, ordinary citizens reacted with a mixture of cautious optimism, anxiety, and profound weariness. Syria in the year 2000 was a country stifled by decades of emergency law, economic stagnation, heavy state control, and international isolation. The rigid socialist economic model introduced decades earlier had decayed into inefficiency, corruption, and widespread cronyism, leaving a growing youth population facing bleak employment prospects. In this stifling environment, the image of Bashar al-Assad offered a distinct psychological contrast to the austere, terrifying legacy of his father. Here was a young man who had lived in London, spoke fluent English, wore Western-style suits, possessed a modern profession as an ophthalmologist, and was married to Asma al-Akraz, a British-educated investment banker of Syrian descent. To many urban intellectuals, frustrated professionals, and hopeful citizens, these biographical details were not merely superficial traits. They were interpreted as clear signs that a modernizing, progressive mindset had arrived at the highest levels of power. Whispers of reform began to circulate rapidly through Damascus, fueled by Bashar's inaugural address. In his speech, delivered to the parliament upon taking office, the new president struck a markedly different rhetorical tone from his father. He spoke openly about the need for administrative modernization, the importance of technological advancement, the reduction of bureaucratic red tape, and the necessity of bringing greater efficiency and transparency to state institutions. He acknowledged the economic hardships facing ordinary citizens and hinted at the need for structural modernization to integrate Syria into the global economy. For a populace that had spent decades accustomed to rigid ideological dogmatism and solemn military marches, hearing a leader speak of administrative reform, internet connectivity, and economic modernization felt revolutionary. Intellectual salons, university common rooms, and private gatherings began to buzz with anticipation. People convinced themselves that the young doctor, untainted by the darkest chapters of the 1980s crackdowns, and seemingly detached from the old guard of ruthless security chiefs, might quietly dismantle the authoritarian police state from within, ushering in an era of gradual democratization without destabilizing the nation. However, this widespread hope for reform collided immediately with the immovable structural reality of the Syrian political system. Bashar al-Assad did not inherit a blank slate. He inherited a deeply entrenched autocracy sustained by a complex network of power. The true architecture of the Syrian state rested not on the formal constitutional presidency alone, but on a sprawling, overlapping constellation of intelligence agencies, military intelligence directorates, the Republican Guard, the 4th Armored Division, and powerful regional commanders who had served his father for decades. These entrenched barons, many of whom belonged to the Alawite minority and owed their immense wealth and security to the preservation of the regime, viewed any radical political opening as an existential threat to their survival. While Bashar held the formal title of president and commander-in-chief, his actual authority in the early months and years of his rule was heavily constrained by the heavyweights of the old guard, who watched his every move, ready to crush any deviation from the established security orthodoxy. The stage was thus set for a tense and fragile balancing act. A young, inexperienced leader trying to project the image of a modern reformer to a hopeful public, while remaining entirely dependent on the brutal, unyielding security apparatus built by his father to maintain his grip on power. The quiet air of anticipation that followed Bashar al-Assad's inauguration soon transformed into something far more active, public, and demanding. Across Damascus and other major Syrian cities, citizens who had spent decades silenced under the emergency laws of the previous era began to test the boundaries of what the new presidency might permit. This brief, luminous, and ultimately fragile window of political openness came to be known as the Damascus Spring. It was an intellectual and cultural awakening born from hope, fueled by cautious optimism, and sustained by a collective desire to see the country modernize not only its economy and internet infrastructure, but its fundamental political life. Writers, artists, lawyers, professors, and ordinary citizens began gathering in private homes, cultural clubs, and university halls to discuss the future of Syria openly. These gatherings, quickly dubbed intellectual salons, became the epicenter of a nationwide conversation about freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. At the heart of the Damascus Spring was a growing network of civil society forums. The most prominent among them was the Riyadh Safe Forum, named after a reform-minded businessman and member of parliament who began hosting regular public discussions on political and economic reform. These meetings drew massive crowds, packing rooms to capacity with people eager to hear speakers critique state inefficiency, demand the lifting of the decades-old state of emergency, call for the release of political prisoners, and advocate for an independent judiciary and a free press. Another influential gathering was the Jamal al-Atassi Forum, which attracted secular intellectuals, leftists, and nationalists alike. In these spaces, topics that had once been whispered behind closed doors for fear of arbitrary arrest and torture were now debated out in the open. People spoke freely about corruption, the stagnation of public institutions, and the urgent need for a constitutional framework that respected basic civil liberties. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of historical change, as if the heavy blanket of fear that had smothered Syria for 30 years was finally being lifted by the gentle breeze of a new century. As these discussions multiplied, they crystallized into formal political demands. In September 2000, a group of 99 prominent Syrian intellectuals, writers, artists, and scientists published a groundbreaking public petition known as the Statement of the 99. The document was a measured yet profoundly daring challenge to the established order. It called for the immediate lifting of the state of emergency, which had been in place since 1963, the abolition of martial law and exceptional courts, the general amnesty for all political prisoners, the recognition of freedom of expression and assembly, and the legal right for citizens to form political parties and civil associations without state interference. The petition did not call for the overthrow of the government or challenge Bashar al-Assad's legitimacy directly. Instead, it appealed to the young president as a reformer, urging him to lead the country out of its political stagnation and fulfill the promises of modernization he had made in his inaugural address. Weeks later, a follow-up petition known as the Statement of the 1000 expanded upon these demands, gathering signatures from an even broader cross-section of Syrian society, including lawyers, engineers, and academics. For a brief moment, the regime's reaction was ambiguous, leading many to believe that a tolerated opposition or a guided transition toward a more inclusive political system might be underway. Bashar al-Assad himself held meetings with some of the reform figures, listening to their proposals and projecting an image of a modern leader open to dialogue. State-run newspapers occasionally published articles discussing the need for administrative efficiency and bureaucratic transparency, and a number of political prisoners were released in symbolic gestures of goodwill. Intellectuals and democracy advocates interpreted these signs as evidence that the reformist wing of the presidential palace was gaining the upper hand against the hardliners of the old guard. Bookstores in Damascus began stocking previously banned literature. Independent newspapers and cultural magazines began to appear on newsstands, and international observers watched with fascination as Syria seemed to be cautiously tiptoeing away from total authoritarianism. However, this burgeoning democratic movement was on a direct collision course with the entrenched security state. The traditional power brokers, intelligence chiefs, and Ba'ath Party hardliners who had built and sustained the regime under Heir al-Assad viewed the Damascus Spring not as a welcome modernization, but as an existential threat to their survival and dominance. To the generals of the military intelligence directorates and the heads of the powerful security branches, public demonstrations, political petitions, and independent salons represented the slippery slope toward chaos, sectarian division, and the collapse of regime control. They argued behind closed doors that any sign of weakness or tolerance toward opposition voices would embolden Islamists, fracture the Alawite-dominated security structure, and unravel the delicate web of patronage and fear that held the country together. The friction between the hopeful reformers and the unyielding security apparatus intensified throughout late 2000 and early 2001. The state-controlled media began shifting its tone, publishing commentaries warning that freedom of expression must not threaten national unity or serve foreign interests. Security officials began intimidating forum organizers, warning participants that their activities were crossing acceptable red lines, and monitoring attendance at the intellectual salons. The fragile tolerance shown by the palace began to evaporate as the security chiefs pressed Bashar al-Assad to rein in the movement before it gained irreversible momentum. The young president, caught between his stated desire for modernization and his total structural dependence on the brutal mechanisms of the old guard, chose preservation over reform. The turning point came swiftly and decisively in the middle of 2001. The government issued strict new guidelines prohibiting unlicensed public gatherings and effectively banning the independent forums from meeting without prior state approval and security clearance. When organizers attempted to defy the restrictions or hold unauthorized meetings, the security forces moved in with rapid severity. Prominent reform figures, including Riyad Saif and other leading intellectuals, were arrested, charged with undermining the state, and subjected to closed trials that resulted in harsh prison sentences. Independent cultural salons were forcibly shut down, critical publications were banned or suppressed, and the nascent civil society organizations were driven underground or forced to dissolve entirely. The closure of the Damascus Spring sent a chilling and unmistakable message across Syrian society. The brief era of open debate, intellectual optimism, and political dialogue was over, crushed beneath the heavy boot of the security state. Ordinary citizens who had hoped that the young ophthalmologist would dismantle the authoritarian police state from within now realized that the fundamental architecture of power remained completely unchanged. While Bashar al-Assad retained his modern veneer, fluent English, and Western suits, the reality of his rule was now painfully clear. He was the custodian of the very same apparatus of fear, surveillance, and repression that his father had forged. The crushing of the Damascus Spring closed the last peaceful avenue for political evolution in Syria, leaving deep reservoirs of resentment, frustration, and disillusionment simmering beneath the surface, setting the stage for the catastrophic conflicts that would erupt a decade later. With the doors of the independent salons firmly locked and the brief intellectual awakening of the Damascus Spring silenced, Bashar al-Assad turned his full attention toward a much more enduring task: consolidating absolute power over the Syrian state. While his early rhetoric had hinted at a softer, more modern style of governance, the reality of maintaining the presidency demanded a firm grip on the complex machinery of control that his father, Heir al-Assad, had spent 3 decades building. This system was not merely a government in the traditional sense. It was a vast, interlocking web of political institutions, intelligence agencies, military units, family networks, and loyal business cartels designed to ensure that ultimate authority remained concentrated within a very small, heavily guarded circle. To understand how Bashar survived and sustained his regime through decades of profound turbulence, one must examine the architecture of power behind the family and the inner workings of the Syrian authoritarian state. At the center of this political architecture stood the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. For decades, the Ba'ath Party had served as the ideological backbone and organizational framework of the regime. Although its socialist slogans and pan-Arab ideals had largely lost their revolutionary fervor, the party remained a crucial instrument of political penetration and social control. Through its local branches, youth organizations, and professional syndicates, the party reached deep into towns, villages, and workplaces across the country. Party membership was often a prerequisite for career advancement in the public sector, university admissions, and government employment, effectively binding the daily lives and economic survival of millions of citizens to the loyalty of the state. Even though real policy decisions were made far away from party congresses, the Ba'ath organization provided the regime with a facade of popular legitimacy and a ready-made apparatus for mobilizing rallies, monitoring local populations, and suppressing dissent at the grassroots level. Yet, the true muscle of the Assad system lay not in the Ba'ath Party, but within the formidable security services, collectively known as the Mukhabarat. These intelligence agencies operated with sweeping powers, far above the ordinary laws of the country. Comprising several distinct branches, including military intelligence, Air Force intelligence, political security, and state security, the Mukhabarat functioned as a state within a state. Each branch maintained its own network of informants, detention facilities, and operational units, often competing with one another in a deliberate strategy by the leadership to prevent any single security chief from becoming too powerful. These agencies monitored phone calls, intercepted correspondence, infiltrated universities and workplaces, and maintained exhaustive files on citizens from all walks of life. The pervasive fear generated by the intelligence apparatus ensured that public criticism of the president or the ruling system was exceedingly rare, as ordinary Syrians knew that a single overheard remark could lead to sudden arrest, interrogation, and indefinite detention without trial. Beneath the watchful eye of the intelligence services stood the military institutions, particularly the elite units tasked with defending the regime from internal threats. The Syrian Arab army was structured carefully to ensure absolute loyalty to the presidential palace, while the regular conscript army reflected the broader demographic makeup of the country. The most powerful and heavily armed units, such as the Republican Guard and the elite 4th Armored Division, were commanded overwhelmingly by officers belonging to the Alawite minority, the religious community from which the Assad family hailed. This sectarian engineering of the military command was a deliberate legacy of Heir al-Assad, designed to guarantee that the armed forces would not hesitate to suppress domestic unrest. The officers who commanded these elite divisions were bound to the president not only by military discipline, but by shared sectarian survival, economic privileges, and deep-seated fears of what might happen to their community if the regime were to fall. Family networks and personal loyalties formed the innermost ring of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Following the death of his older brother Basil, who had been groomed for the presidency for years, Bashar had to quickly establish his own authority among powerful relatives who controlled key pillars of the state. His younger brother, Maher al-Assad, emerged as a central military figure, commanding the elite 4th Armored Division and the Republican Guard, thereby securing direct familial control over the most lethal forces in the capital. Other relatives, spanning the extended Assad and Makhlouf clans, dominated lucrative sectors of the Syrian economy, from telecommunications and oil imports to real estate and retail trade. This fusion of political power and familial wealth created a powerful oligarchy whose fortunes were entirely dependent on the preservation of the presidency. In addition to family members, Bashar al-Assad cultivated a tightly knit circle of loyal business figures who financed the regime and helped insulate it from international pressure. Chief among them was Rami Makhlouf, a maternal cousin of the president, who amassed a vast business empire that controlled a massive share of Syria's commercial activity. Through monopolies, exclusive state contracts, and strategic partnerships, these crony capitalists accumulated enormous fortunes while maintaining a symbiotic relationship with the political elite. The businessmen provided the financial resources necessary to fund state operations, patronage networks, and security apparatuses, while the regime provided them with legal protection, regulatory exemptions, and immunity from meaningful competition. This economic patronage ensured that a powerful class of wealthy elites had a strong vested interest in maintaining the status quo, even as the country's broader economic conditions began to deteriorate. As Bashar al-Assad settled into the presidency, he also reshaped the inner workings of the presidential palace to reflect his own managerial style. While his father had ruled through a hierarchical, highly centralized command structure, reminiscent of a stern patriarch, Bashar initially attempted to project the image of a modern executive aided by technocrats, advisory boards, and international consultants. He surrounded himself with educated professionals, modernizing reformers, and Western-trained economists who drafted plans for administrative decentralization, banking reform, and technological modernization. However, whenever these modernizing initiatives collided with the entrenched interests of the old guard or threatened the prerogatives of the security chiefs, the traditional structures invariably prevailed. The modern veneer of the presidential office proved to be a thin gloss over a deeply entrenched, repressive security state. The combination of authoritarian politics, intelligence surveillance, military patronage, and economic monopoly created a highly resilient governing system. By distributing privileges to loyal constituencies, particularly minority communities fearful of sectarian instability, while ruthlessly neutralizing any independent political actors, the regime managed to project an aura of unshakable permanence. Yet, this system was inherently brittle. Because power was concentrated in the hands of a narrow family clique and a privileged security elite, there was no room for peaceful political evolution, genuine opposition, or institutional accountability. The mechanisms that kept Bashar al-Assad securely in power also ensured that any future challenge to the state would not be met with political compromise, but with the full, unyielding force of the security apparatus. While Bashar al-Assad and his inner circle busied themselves securing their grip on political institutions, intelligence agencies, and economic monopolies, a very different reality was taking shape across the towns, villages, and city outskirts of Syria. Beneath the calm surface projected by state media, the country was quietly filling with pressure. The first decade of the 21st century was a period of intense demographic, economic, and social strain. Long-standing problems that had been ignored, mishandled, or masked by the regime for decades began to compound one another. By the end of the 2000s, Syria had transformed into a society under immense stress, where millions of ordinary citizens struggled against rising hardship while watching a small, privileged elite hoard the nation's wealth. One of the most powerful engines of this growing pressure was rapid population growth. Syria experienced a dramatic demographic boom in the decades leading up to 2011, resulting in a remarkably young population. More than half of all Syrians were under the age of 20. This youthful generation entered a job market that was completely unequipped to absorb them. The state, which had traditionally acted as the primary employer for university graduates and young adults through the public sector, was steadily shrinking its hiring capacity under the weight of bureaucratic bloat and economic reforms that favored private crony capitalists. As a result, hundreds of thousands of young people found themselves facing bleak employment prospects. University degrees no longer guaranteed a stable job, and educated youths were left with few options other than low-paying informal labor, underemployment, or emigration. Economic mismanagement by the government severely worsened these employment challenges. Following his accession to power, Bashar al-Assad had promised a modernized economy, encouraging private investment and opening up banking and trade sectors. However, these market reforms were designed not to benefit the wider population, but to enrich the president's family members, relatives, and select business allies. Monopolies were handed to regime insiders, while state subsidies on basic goods like fuel, heating oil, and flour, subsidies that had long protected the poorest segments of Syrian society, were gradually reduced or eliminated. The cost of living soared dramatically. Families found it increasingly difficult to afford basic food items, electricity, and medicine. The gap between the ultra-wealthy elite living in upscale Damascus neighborhoods and the struggling working-class majority grew into an unbridgeable chasm. This economic squeeze was felt most acutely in the rural agricultural regions and the impoverished outskirts of major cities. For generations, farming had sustained large portions of the Syrian population, particularly in the northern and eastern provinces such as Al-Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor, and the rural expanses surrounding Hama and Homs. However, rural communities faced a catastrophic combination of poor state planning, over-extraction of groundwater, and a historic natural disaster. Beginning around 2006 and lasting through 2010, Syria suffered one of the worst multi-year droughts in modern recorded history. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died by the hundreds of thousands, and underground water sources dried up completely. The government's response to this agricultural catastrophe was woefully inadequate. Rather than providing emergency relief, financial aid, or structural support to stricken farmers, the state largely abandoned rural communities. Decades of state-sponsored agricultural policies that had encouraged water-intensive crops like cotton and wheat had already severely depleted the country's water table. When the drought struck, the safety nets that might have cushioned the blow were completely absent. Desperate and destitute, rural families could no longer make a living on the land. This agricultural collapse triggered a massive wave of internal migration. Between 2006 and 2010, an estimated 1 million to 1.5 billion rural residents, farmers, herders, and day laborers, abandoned their scorched fields and ancestral villages. They packed their meager belongings and headed toward the urban centers, settling in the sprawling informal housing belts that ringed cities like Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Deira. These makeshift suburbs grew overnight, constructed from cinder blocks and corrugated metal without proper sanitation, clean drinking water, electricity, or paved roads. These neglected urban peripheries became hotbeds of social resentment and frustration. The new arrivals joined an already disgruntled urban poor, creating densely packed neighborhoods where poverty, unemployment, and a deep sense of abandonment prevailed. Young men from these rural to urban migrant families found themselves stranded on the margins of society, excluded from the wealth and opportunities enjoyed by the regime-backed elite. They lived within plain sight of the luxurious lifestyle of the ruling class, deepening their feelings of alienation and anger. The state, rather than addressing their grievances or investing in social services, viewed these impoverished belts primarily through a security lens, deploying informants and police patrols to monitor potential unrest rather than building schools or hospitals. Regional tensions and international geopolitics added further friction to an already volatile domestic environment. Syria's strategic alliances, particularly its close ties with Iran and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, along with its long-standing hostility toward Israel and fluctuating relations with Arab neighbors, placed heavy demands on the nation's resources. While the state poured funds into security and military readiness, public infrastructure deteriorated. Corruption became an everyday burden for ordinary citizens. Bribes were required for everything from securing a simple government document to accessing basic medical care or obtaining a telephone line. The state bureaucracy, bloated and corrupt, offered no recourse for citizens seeking justice or fairness. By the end of the 2000s, the cumulative weight of demographic pressure, economic inequality, corruption, agricultural ruin, and social displacement had thoroughly hollowed out the regime's claims to legitimacy. While the security apparatus remained fiercely vigilant and capable of crushing isolated dissent, the underlying social contract between the state and the people had completely ruptured. The population was exhausted, anxious, and deeply resentful of a system that offered no future for the young and no relief for the poor. When the winds of political upheaval began to sweep across the wider Middle East in early 2011, Syria was a dry forest waiting for a single spark. The structural decay engineered by decades of authoritarian rule had left the nation fragile, fractured, and standing dangerously close to the edge of a precipice. The dry forest that Syria had become during the first decade of the 21st century needed only a single spark to ignite. That spark came in the early weeks of the year 2011, blown across the borders by an unprecedented wave of popular uprisings that swept through the Middle East. Across Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, decades-old authoritarian regimes began to shudder and collapse under the immense weight of public fury. Millions of Arabs watched television screens in disbelief and awe as ordinary citizens flooded public squares, demanding freedom, dignity, and the fall of the ruling elite. In Syria, despite the suffocating presence of the state security apparatus and the terrifying memories of past state violence, a profound sense of possibility began to stir in the hearts of the oppressed. People began to whisper in cafes, university hallways, and family living rooms that change might finally be possible. The initial spark of the Syrian uprising did not ignite in the grand boulevards of Damascus or the intellectual salons of Aleppo. Instead, it struck in Deraa, a gritty, neglected agricultural hub located in the southern plains near the Jordanian border. Deraa had suffered more than most regions from the devastating multi-year drought that had crippled rural Syria between 2006 and 2010. Its farming communities had been abandoned by the central government, leaving thousands of families destitute and forcing a massive migration of impoverished young men into the city's informal suburbs. Economic stagnation, rampant corruption, and the daily humiliation imposed by local security officers had turned Deraa into a pressure cooker of resentment. The fuse was lit in late February and early March 2011, sparked not by political organizers, but by the reckless actions of local security forces against children. A group of schoolboys aged 10 to 15, inspired by the revolutionary graffiti they had seen on satellite television channels broadcasting from Tunisia and Cairo, spray-painted anti-regime slogans on a wall in downtown Deraa. Phrases like "It is your turn, doctor," a direct mocking reference to Bashar al-Assad's medical background, and "The people want the fall of the regime" appeared on the masonry. For a regime that viewed absolute control as the cornerstone of its survival, such minor acts of youthful defiance were treated as existential threats. Local security officers, operating under the command of the regional head of intelligence, rushed to the school, rounded up the children, and threw them into custody. What happened next outraged the entire community. The boys were detained, interrogated, and subjected to severe physical abuse and torture to extract confessions and names of adult instigators. When a delegation of respected elders, tribal leaders, and parents from Deraa went to the local security branch to plead for the children's release, they were met with arrogant contempt. The senior security official in charge, a cousin of Bashar al-Assad named Arif Najib, reportedly insulted the delegation, telling them to forget about their sons, go home, and make new children, or, if they could not, to send their wives so the security forces could do it for them. This callous cruelty crossed a red line in traditional Syrian society, where honor, family, and respect for elders are deeply valued. The insult ignited a fury that could no longer be contained by fear. On Friday, March 15, 2011, small groups of protesters gathered in Deraa following midday prayers to demand the release of the detained children, the punishment of the abusive officials, and basic civil reforms. They carried no weapons, only olive branches and banners calling for freedom and dignity. Similar small gatherings took place in downtown Damascus around the historic Hamidiyya Souk and near the Ministry of Interior. While the Damascus demonstration was swiftly and violently dispersed by police who beat protesters with batons and arrested dozens, the gathering in Deraa proved different. Local security forces opened fire with live ammunition on the unarmed crowd, killing at least 2 demonstrators. Instead of terrifying the populace into submission, the blood of the fallen protesters acted as fuel for the fire. Funerals held the following day turned into massive political rallies, drawing thousands of mourners from surrounding villages who marched through the streets chanting slogans against the regime. The protests quickly spread beyond Daraa, rippling across the Syrian landscape like wildfire. By late March and early April, demonstrations erupted in towns and cities across the country. In the coastal cities of Banias and Latakia, in the industrial hubs of Homs and Hama, in the Kurdish-majority towns of the northeast, and within the sprawling, impoverished informal housing belts that ringed Damascus and Aleppo. Young and old, men and women, workers, students, and professionals poured into the streets. For decades, the Assad regime had successfully maintained an atmosphere of atomization and terror, convincing citizens that any dissent would be met with immediate and total destruction. Now, standing shoulder to shoulder in public squares, ordinary people discovered a collective courage that shattered the psychological barrier of fear. The government's response to this unprecedented nationwide challenge was a fateful mixture of denial, tactical hesitation, and brutal escalation. In public, President Bashar al-Assad and state media attempted to downplay the significance of the unrest, attributing the protests to foreign conspiracies, armed gangs, Salafist extremists, and external instigators seeking to destabilize Syria's secular harmony. State television broadcast reports claiming that the demonstrators were paid saboteurs carrying foreign weapons. At the same time, the regime deployed a classic authoritarian playbook, a combination of token concessions paired with unsparing brute force. Assad appointed a new prime minister, announced minor salary increases for public employees, released a handful of petty criminals from prison, and promised superficial administrative reforms. Yet, these gestures were entirely hollow, utterly failing to address the core demands of the populace. Behind the scenes, the true power of the state, the complex web of intelligence agencies, military units, and loyalist militias, was unleashed to crush the uprising before it could permanently weaken the regime. The security forces, trained for decades in domestic surveillance and suppression, responded to peaceful protests with lethal force. Snipers were positioned on rooftops overlooking public squares, shooting demonstrators as they gathered. Tanks and armored personnel carriers were rolled into cities like Daraa, Homs, and later Hama, cutting off neighborhoods, destroying water and electricity supplies, and shelling residential areas. Thousands of protesters were rounded up in mass arrest campaigns, packed into overcrowded detention facilities where torture and systematic abuse were utilized to break the spirit of the opposition. Despite the escalating violence, the protests continued to grow, fueled by the mounting casualties and the regime's refusal to offer genuine political compromise. Funerals transformed into protests, and protests transformed into massive anti-regime rallies that demanded nothing less than the complete removal of Bashar al-Assad and his ruling circle. As the state security apparatus intensified its crackdown, community self-defense groups began to form. Young men in protesting neighborhoods took up primitive weapons, hunting rifles, and eventually military-grade firearms smuggled across borders or captured from local police stations to protect their families and neighborhoods from rampaging security forces and government-backed militias known as Shabiha. By the summer of 2011, the character of the Syrian crisis had fundamentally shifted. What had begun in March as peaceful, localized demonstrations sparked by the detention of schoolboys in Daraa had transformed into a nationwide uprising. The social contract that had bound Syrians to the Assad family for over 4 decades was permanently torn apart. The regime's choice to rely exclusively on military might and extreme violence rather than political dialogue closed every door to a peaceful resolution. Syria stood at a terrifying crossroads, having crossed the threshold from civil unrest into a full-scale national crisis from which there was no turning back. The transformation of Syria from a nation in political turmoil into a complex battleground was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the tragic result of a deliberate escalation. As the spring of 2011 turned into the scorching heat of summer, the peaceful demonstrations that had filled the streets of Daraa, Homs, Banias, and the suburbs of Damascus faced an unyielding wall of state steel and fire. When tens of thousands of citizens marched demanding dignity, freedom, and the fall of the authoritarian system, the government did not offer dialogue, reform, or compromise. Instead, President Bashar al-Assad chose the path of total confrontation. Tanks rolled down residential avenues, artillery shells slammed into apartment blocks, and security forces launched sweeping campaigns of mass arrests. Thousands of citizens were pulled from their homes or snatched off the streets, packed into crowded detention centers where torture and abuse became systematic tools of state control. Yet, despite the relentless violence, the spirit of defiance across the country refused to break. For months, ordinary people stood their ground, shielding themselves with makeshift banners and facing sniper fire with empty hands. However, living under daily bombardment and watching neighbors, friends, and family members cut down by military gunfire eventually forced a fundamental reevaluation among the protesters. The realization settled deeply into the minds of the population that peaceful resistance alone could not stop a regime willing to burn its own cities to stay in power. Young men in rebellious neighborhoods, exhausted by grief and fury, began to organize local defense committees. Armed with little more than hunting rifles, ancient pistols, and whatever weapons they could buy on black markets or capture from isolated police outposts, they tried to protect their streets from the rampaging security forces and government-backed militias known as the Shabiha. These spontaneous neighborhood defense groups marked the very beginning of an armed rebellion. What started as local protection soon evolved into a broader military resistance as defecting soldiers, men who refused orders to fire on unarmed civilians, began walking away from their barracks with their rifles, personnel carriers, and tanks. These military defectors offered tactical experience, organizational structure, and heavy firepower to the newly forming insurgent units, giving birth to what would become known as the Free Syrian Army. By late 2011 and early 2012, the nature of the conflict had irrevocably crossed a threshold from popular uprising to civil war. The map of Syria began to shatter. Small towns, rural districts, and entire neighborhoods within major cities slipped away from central government control as insurgent factions pushed out state security forces. The regime responded by intensifying its military campaigns, turning residential areas into combat zones. But as the fighting dragged on, the domestic landscape drew the attention of regional and global powers, transforming Syria into an international chessboard. The conflict ceased to be a simple domestic struggle between an entrenched dictatorship and its rebellious citizens. It became a magnet for competing geopolitical ambitions, sectarian rivalries, and proxy warfare that would engulf the entire Middle East. On one side of the expanding conflict stood the core allies of the Assad government. The Iranian leadership viewed the survival of the Syrian regime as an absolute strategic necessity for its regional influence, providing vital financial assistance, military advisors, and thousands of allied militia fighters, including members of the Lebanese Hezbollah movement and Shiite volunteers from Iraq and Afghanistan. Later, the Russian Federation would step directly into the military arena, providing devastating air support that completely altered the balance of forces on the ground. For Moscow, preserving the Syrian state and maintaining its naval and air facilities in the Mediterranean was a matter of superpower prestige and strategic reach. On the opposing side, a shifting coalition of regional states, including Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, along with Western nations, threw their political and material support behind various opposition factions, hoping to weaken or oust the Assad government. This influx of foreign money, weapons, and diplomatic backing supercharged the conflict, raising the stakes far beyond Syria's borders. As the war dragged on through its second and third years, the factional landscape grew bewilderingly complex. What had begun as a clear binary struggle between a government and a unified democratic opposition fractured into a multi-sided labyrinth of armed groups. In the northeast of the country, Syrian Kurdish populations, long marginalized and denied basic cultural rights by the Ba'athist state, seized the opportunity to establish local self-administration, forming their own armed units known as the People's Protection Units, or IPK. While fighting the government in certain areas and cooperating with them in others, the Kurdish forces primarily focused on defending their ancestral lands and establishing an autonomous region known as Rojava. Meanwhile, the prolonged chaos, security vacuum, and ideological vacuums created fertile ground for extremist organizations. Radical jihadist groups, drawing foreign fighters from across the globe, infiltrated the Syrian opposition landscape. Organizations such as Jabhat al-Nusra, the official Syrian branch of al-Qaeda, and later the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, capitalized on the breakdown of law in order to carve out vast territories through extreme brutality and uncompromising ideology. These jihadist factions fought not only the regime and rival rebel groups, but also each other, turning parts of Syria into nightmare landscapes of terror and devastation. For the ordinary Syrian citizen trapped in the middle of this multi-sided catastrophe, daily life became an endless cycle of survival, loss, and despair. Millions of people were forced to flee their homes, packing whatever belongings they could carry into worn-out suitcases and walking toward internal displacement camps or dangerous journeys across international borders. Cities that had stood for millennia as bustling centers of commerce, culture, and multi-ethnic harmony were reduced to ghostly expanses of shattered concrete and twisted metal. The economy went into freefall, basic services collapsed, and food, clean water, and medical supplies became scarce luxuries. The social fabric that had bound diverse communities together for generations was torn to shreds by sectarian rhetoric, fear, and revenge. By the time the war entered its middle years, the hope for a quick resolution had vanished into the smoke of continuous battlefields. Syria was no longer a single unified nation. It was a fragmented mosaic of war zones held together by rival factions, foreign patrons, and an unprecedented level of human suffering. The transformation from an inspiring cry for freedom in the spring of 2011 into a devastating civil war left an indelible scar on the national consciousness. The country had become a tragic monument to the cost of absolute rule and the terrifying speed with which a nation could be torn apart when its leadership chose destruction over compromise. The long, dark night of the Syrian civil war had truly begun, casting a shadow that would stretch far across the decades to come. As the Syrian conflict dug its roots deeper into the fractured geography of the country, the government in Damascus initiated a relentless, calculated military campaign designed to break the will of any region that had slipped from its grasp. President Bashar al-Assad's military strategy shifted from conventional defense to a punishing war of attrition, targeting opposition-held neighborhoods, towns, and cities with overwhelming firepower. The human cost of this escalation began to mount with terrifying speed, transforming once vibrant urban landscapes into zones of profound humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of civilians found themselves trapped inside besieged districts, cut off from food, medicine, electricity, and clean water, while the sounds of artillery fire and airstrikes echoed endlessly through the shattered streets. The mechanics of the government's military campaigns were systematic and devastating. Opposition-held districts across Homs, Idlib, the rural belt surrounding Damascus, and parts of Aleppo were subjected to prolonged sieges. In these enclosed zones, basic supplies dwindled to nothing, forcing residents to survive on meager rations of grass, leaves, and whatever flour could be smuggled through secret tunnels or hidden checkpoints. Overhead, military aircraft and helicopters dropped high-explosive ordnance and crude barrel bombs, drums packed with explosives, fuel, and metal fragments, into densely populated residential areas. These weapons, dropped indiscriminately on markets, hospitals, and apartment buildings, leveled entire city blocks and buried families beneath mounds of concrete and twisted iron. The deliberate destruction of civic infrastructure ensured that normal life became entirely impossible, driving massive waves of families to flee their homes in search of safety elsewhere in the country or across international borders. Inside government-controlled areas, a parallel apparatus of control and punishment operated with chilling efficiency. The state security services, working in tandem with military intelligence and loyalist militias, cast a vast net of arrests across the country. Thousands of dissidents, peaceful protesters, relief workers, and ordinary citizens suspected of harboring anti-government sympathies were detained at checkpoints, swept up in neighborhood raids, or summoned for interrogation from which they never returned. These detainees were channeled into a sprawling network of detention centers and underground interrogation facilities. Within these grim walls, systematic torture and abuse were utilized not merely as tools for extracting information, but as instruments of institutional intimidation designed to crush dissent permanently. Human rights organizations, local documentation groups, and international bodies repeatedly gathered harrowing accounts and smuggled photographic evidence detailing widespread torture, severe overcrowding, and death in detention, painting a grim picture of the state's internal security apparatus. Compounding the devastation of conventional bombardments and mass detentions were recurring allegations of chemical weapons use in various contested zones across Syria. These incidents sparked intense international outrage, diplomatic crises, and repeated investigations by global bodies, most notably the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and various United Nations fact-finding missions. The deployment of toxic agents in densely populated areas heightened the terror experienced by civilians, drawing sharp condemnation from Western governments and triggering fierce international debates over accountability, sovereignty, and the enforcement of established international norms. Despite repeated denials from Damascus and its diplomatic defenders, these episodes remained among the most deeply contentious and polarizing flashpoints of the entire conflict, drawing global attention to the unchecked brutality with which the war was being waged. Throughout this dark chapter, the daily reality for ordinary citizens was defined by an unyielding struggle for endurance. Hospitals operated out of damp basements with dwindling supplies of bandages and painkillers. Surgeons performed emergency procedures under the flickering light of mobile phones, and schools functioned in makeshift underground shelters to protect children from falling shells. Yet, amidst the ruins and the immense grief of losing family members, neighbors, and friends, communities developed intricate networks of mutual aid. Bakeries were rebuilt underground, local water purification systems were jury-rigged from salvaged parts, and underground rescue teams worked tirelessly with bare hands and basic tools to pull survivors from the wreckage after each bombardment. The resilience of the population stood in stark contrast to the systematic destruction raining down from the skies, illustrating a profound human refusal to surrender entirely to despair. By the middle years of the decade, the relentless military campaign had succeeded in altering the physical and demographic map of Syria, though at a staggering and irreversible cost. The historic identity of ancient cities had been rewritten by fire and steel, and millions of citizens were displaced into sprawling tent camps along borders or cast into the uncertain currents of global refugee migrations. The war without mercy had hollowed out the nation's economic foundation and shattered its social fabric, leaving behind a scarred landscape where survival itself was a daily victory. The policies executed during this grim period ensured that whatever military objectives the government achieved would be built upon a foundation of profound national ruin, forever altering the course of modern Syrian history. As the conflict in Syria entered its fifth agonizing year, the government in Damascus faced an existential threat that pushed its military forces to the absolute brink of collapse. Large swaths of territory had slipped from state control, opposition factions and radical Islamist groups were advancing on multiple fronts, and the loyalist army was exhausted, depleted by years of relentless attrition, desertions, and casualties. For President Bashar al-Assad, survival was no longer guaranteed by domestic strength alone. The preservation of his regime required a massive, coordinated intervention by foreign powers who shared a strategic interest in preventing his downfall. Thus, the war entered a new internationalized phase, defined by the decisive entry of external allies whose military, financial, and logistical support fundamentally shifted the balance of power on the ground and rescued the government from impending defeat. The most foundational pillar of external support came from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since the earliest days of the uprising, Tehran viewed the survival of the Assad government as an absolute vital interest, serving as the central linchpin of its regional axis of influence. Iran's involvement evolved rapidly from financial assistance, military advice, and strategic coordination into the direct deployment of personnel. Officers from the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps arrived in Syria to plan operations, train loyalist units, and establish a parallel command structure. Furthermore, Tehran mobilized and deployed thousands of allied foreign Shia militia fighters from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon to bolster the thinning ranks of the Syrian Arab army. Among these, the Lebanese movement Hezbollah played an indispensable combat role. Hezbollah fighters, possessing guerrilla warfare expertise and high ideological motivation, spearheaded critical offensives along the Lebanese border and in key strategic provinces, securing supply lines and defending vital urban centers that were essential for the regime's survival. While regional allies stabilized the ground situation and prevented immediate collapse, the strategic trajectory of the conflict transformed dramatically in September 2015 with the direct military intervention of the Russian Federation. Moscow had maintained a decades-long alliance with Damascus, anchored by strategic naval facilities on the Syrian Mediterranean coast, and viewed the potential overthrow of Assad by armed opposition groups as a dangerous repetition of the chaotic regime changes witnessed elsewhere in the Middle East. President Vladimir Putin authorized the deployment of the Russian aerospace forces to Syria, establishing a major airbase at Hmeimim near Latakia, and deploying advanced combat jets, attack helicopters, air defense systems, and military advisors. Russian warplanes launched sustained air campaigns targeting opposition-held areas across the country, fundamentally altering the military capabilities available to the Syrian government. The introduction of Russian air power provided the decisive tactical advantage that the Syrian military desperately needed. Operating with impunity from the skies, Russian jets systematically degraded opposition positions, command centers, supply routes, and ammunition depots. This air support enabled Syrian government forces and allied militias to transition from a defensive posture to a coordinated offensive strategy. Over the course of late 2015 and 2016, loyalist forces, backed by unrelenting aerial bombardments and directed by foreign commanders, began recapturing strategic towns and rural belts that had been held by insurgents for years. The intervention not only halted the territorial expansion of anti-government groups, but systematically rolled back their gains, isolating urban strongholds and fracturing the cohesion of the armed opposition. Beyond military hardware and air support, the foreign intervention involved deep political and diplomatic backing on the international stage. Russia utilized its veto power as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council to shield the Assad government from binding international sanctions, military authorization, and punitive resolutions related to human rights violations and chemical weapons use. Moscow consistently framed its intervention as a legitimate campaign against international terrorism, successfully shifting the global narrative away from internal political dissent toward a broader war against extremist organizations. This diplomatic shield allowed Damascus to maintain a veneer of international legitimacy despite widespread diplomatic isolation and severe Western economic sanctions. The presence of foreign allies also brought complex dynamics and strategic dependencies for the Syrian state. While Russian and Iranian intervention saved the government from defeat, it simultaneously eroded Damascus's independent decision-making authority. Military campaigns, strategic priorities, and regional negotiations were increasingly coordinated through or dictated by Moscow and Tehran, turning Syria into a theater of competing and overlapping foreign interests. Military commanders from Iran and Russia operated alongside Syrian institutions, sometimes establishing parallel authorities and spheres of influence within the country's sovereign borders. Yet, for Bashar al-Assad and his inner circle, these concessions were a necessary price to pay for ultimate political survival. By the end of 2016, the coalition of domestic loyalist forces, regional militias led by Hezbollah, Iranian strategic direction, and Russian air power had successfully altered the military reality of the Syrian civil war. The immediate threat of regime overthrow had been decisively neutralized, and the government had regained the initiative across key demographic and economic centers of the country. The alliance that saved Assad demonstrated the brutal efficiency of external state power when applied to an internal fracture, cementing a new chapter of the conflict where local aspirations were subordinated to regional and global geopolitical ambitions. The ruins upon which the government's military resurgence was built were vast, but the survival of the presidency was assured through the unwavering commitment of its foreign patrons. The ultimate test of the newly fortified alliance between the Syrian government and its foreign patrons came down to a single, sprawling urban battleground, the ancient city of Aleppo. Divided for years between government-held western districts and insurgent-controlled eastern neighborhoods, Aleppo stood as the preeminent symbol of the Syrian civil war's devastation and strategic deadlock. For President Bashar al-Assad's administration, regaining control of the country's former economic capital was not merely a military objective. It was an absolute political and symbolic imperative. The battle for Aleppo would test the coordination of Russian air power, Iranian-led ground militias, and the depleted Syrian Arab army, while capturing the anxious attention of the entire international community as a monumental turning point in the prolonged conflict. Throughout the autumn of 2016, the situation in eastern Aleppo grew increasingly desperate for the armed opposition groups and the civilian population trapped within the enclave. Syrian government forces, heavily reinforced by allied regional militias and operating under the strategic guidance of foreign commanders, launched a relentless campaign designed to sever all remaining supply lines into the opposition-held sectors. The airspace above the city belonged entirely to the Russian aerospace forces and the Syrian Air Force, whose warplanes conducted continuous bombing runs against insurgent positions, communication nodes, and supply depots. The encirclement tightened steadily, cutting off food, medical supplies, and fuel, plunging hundreds of thousands of residents into an acute humanitarian crisis that drew international condemnation and urgent calls for ceasefires from the United Nations. The strategic importance of Aleppo stemmed from its unique position in the geography of the Syrian conflict. As the nation's largest industrial and commercial hub, owning the city meant reclaiming the heartland of Syria's economic life and dealing a psychological blow to the insurgency that would resonate across the entire region. For the opposition, holding eastern Aleppo was a matter of survival and prestige, representing their primary urban stronghold and a vital counterweight to government authority in Damascus. Consequently, both sides poured immense resources into the battle, turning narrow streets, residential blocks, and historic quarters into a brutal war of attrition. Insurgent factions launched multiple counteroffensives from the outside in attempts to break the government siege, utilizing car bombs, tunnels, and heavy artillery. But these desperate efforts were systematically repelled by the combined might of loyalist forces and foreign airstrikes. By December 2016, the defense of eastern Aleppo had completely collapsed under the weight of relentless bombardment and overwhelming ground pressure. As government troops and allied militia units advanced block by block through the pulverized ruins of the eastern districts, negotiated evacuation agreements were forged to handle the transfer of remaining combatants and civilians out of the city. Thousands of opposition fighters, along with their families and civilians choosing not to live under restored state authority, boarded green buses destined for opposition-held territories in northern Syria. The final departure of these convoys marked the end of years of divided control and signaled the most significant military victory for the Assad government since the uprising began in 2011. The recapture of Aleppo fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Syrian civil war, creating a profound psychological and strategic turning point. It demonstrated beyond doubt that the foreign military intervention initiated by Russia and Iran had successfully reversed the momentum of the conflict, rescuing the central government from imminent defeat and restoring its authority over major population centers. While the victory secured Bashar al-Assad's immediate political survival and consolidated state control over the country's vital western axis, it was achieved against a haunting backdrop of total devastation. The ancient souks, historic mosques, residential apartment blocks, and industrial infrastructure of Aleppo were left in ruins, bearing silent witness to the immense human and material cost of a battle that reshaped the destiny of a fractured nation. Following the monumental turning point of Aleppo in late 2016, the Syrian civil war entered a new and definitive phase. The military balance had shifted decisively in favor of President Bashar al-Assad's government, backed by its steadfast foreign allies. Over the subsequent years, the map of Syria underwent a systematic transformation. Pockets of armed opposition resistance, which had once threatened the very survival of the regime in the suburbs of Damascus, Homs, and across southern and central Syria, were gradually compressed, besieged, and eventually forced into surrender or negotiated evacuations. Through a combination of relentless military pressure, devastating ground offensives, and localized surrender deals that funneled remaining combatants toward the northern province of Idlib, government forces steadily expanded their territorial control across the nation's vital western and central corridors. Yet, this creeping restoration of state authority was realized against a haunting and apocalyptic backdrop. The victory that secured Bashar al-Assad's political survival was built upon the literal and figurative ruins of a once vibrant nation. Across Syria, major cities and towns that had been contested during the years of fierce urban warfare resembled post-apocalyptic landscapes. Historic neighborhoods, bustling commercial markets, apartment complexes, schools, and hospitals lay reduced to pulverized concrete, twisted metal, and shattered glass. Entire districts in cities like Homs, Daraa, and the eastern sectors of Aleppo stood empty and desolate, devoid of the millions of citizens who had once inhabited them. The physical infrastructure of the country, its electrical grids, water treatment plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks, was battered and broken, creating an unprecedented crisis of habitability. Beyond the staggering physical destruction, the human cost of the conflict defined the true scope of the tragedy. Millions of Syrians had been displaced from their homes, constituting one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Millions more fled across international borders, seeking refuge in neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and further afield into Europe, scattering families across continents. Those who remained within government-held areas faced a daily struggle for basic survival. The Syrian economy, once self-sufficient in many respects, had collapsed under the combined weight of years of war, international economic sanctions, the loss of key agricultural and oil-producing regions, and rampant inflation. The national currency, the Syrian pound, plummeted in value, plunging the vast majority of the population into deep poverty. Basic necessities such as cooking gas, electricity, heating fuel, and medicine became scarce and prohibitively expensive, creating long daily queues for bread and essentials that became a grim staple of everyday life. As the military phase of the conflict began to recede into a fractured stalemate, the Assad government confronted the monumental and paralyzing challenge of reconstruction. Economically isolated by comprehensive Western sanctions and cut off from major international financial institutions, the state lacked the vast capital resources required to rebuild the shattered country. The government attempted to project an image of normalcy and gradual recovery, encouraging displaced citizens to return to cleared areas and organizing state-managed reconstruction initiatives in select neighborhoods. However, these efforts were frequently overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of the devastation and the reality of a depleted state treasury. Reconstruction funds from friendly nations, primarily Russia and Iran, were limited and came with their own strategic and economic conditions, leaving large swaths of the country frozen in a state of permanent ruin. Inside the corridors of power in Damascus, Bashar al-Assad viewed this fragile and devastated landscape through the lens of political survival and total vindication. For the regime, the fact that the state had withstood an international conspiracy, armed insurrection, and economic strangulation was framed as a historic triumph of national sovereignty. The state apparatus, intelligence agencies, and loyalist networks reasserted their control with renewed vigor, ensuring that political dissent remained suppressed and that the centralized authority of the Ba'ath Party was re-established across the recovered territories. Networks of loyalist businessmen, war profiteers, and security figures stepped into the vacuum, consolidating new economic power structures built around smuggling, reconstruction contracts, and patronage. Thus, the victory that consolidated Bashar al-Assad's grip on power was a victory of ruling over ashes. The Syria that emerged from the crucible of war was profoundly transformed. Fractured into different zones of control involving foreign military forces, impoverished, politically isolated from the West, and bearing physical and psychological scars that would take generations to heal. The government had successfully preserved its institutional core and ensured its leader remained entrenched in the presidential palace, but it presided over a hollowed-out country where the promise of national renewal had been entirely consumed by the fires of a devastating civil war. Following the years of intense military conflict and the physical devastation that left much of the country in ruins, the Syrian government under President Bashar al-Assad faced a new type of battlefield: the international arena. While military forces had successfully secured control over major urban centers and domestic opposition threats had been largely compressed or contained, the regime remained politically and economically isolated by much of the Western world. The central objective for Damascus shifted from battlefield survival to securing international legitimacy, breaking through sweeping diplomatic and economic blockades, and navigating a complex web of global and regional power politics. From the perspective of Western governments, including the United States, the European Union, and key allies, Bashar al-Assad was viewed as a pariah leader. The staggering human toll of the civil war, documented reports of widespread human rights violations, the use of sieges, and chemical weapons incidents cemented a Western policy of non-recognition and stringent economic isolation. Western capitals maintained that there could be no diplomatic normalization or financial assistance for reconstruction without a genuine and comprehensive political transition implemented in accordance with United Nations resolutions. Comprehensive economic sanctions, designed to restrict the regime's access to international financial systems, foreign currency, and petroleum markets, remained firmly in place. These measures were intended to prevent the consolidation of the regime's victory and to pressure Damascus into making political concessions. In response to this Western-led isolation, the Assad government pursued a deliberate strategy of diplomatic defiance and patience, confident that time and shifting geopolitical priorities would work in its favor. Damascus maintained that its sovereignty had been preserved against a foreign-backed conspiracy and rejected any external interference in Syria's internal affairs. Throughout the diplomatic stalemate, the United Nations attempted to facilitate political dialogue through various initiatives, including the Geneva peace talks and later the Syrian Constitutional Committee. However, these diplomatic tracks frequently stalled due to profound disagreements between the government, opposition representatives, and international stakeholders over power sharing, constitutional reform, and the future governance of the country. While Western nations maintained their hardline stance, a gradual and significant shift began to take place within the broader Middle East. In the years following the peak of the military conflict, several regional governments that had previously severed ties or actively supported opposition factions began to reassess their policies toward Damascus. Arab states that had once viewed Assad's downfall as inevitable gradually confronted the reality of his political survival. Concerns over regional stability, the desire to curb the expanding influence of non-state actors, drug trafficking concerns involving captagon production within parts of the region, and the pragmatic goal of countering other regional rivalries created a new opening for diplomatic re-engagement. This regional shift culminated in incremental steps toward normalization. Neighboring and regional capitals began reopening diplomatic missions, dispatching envoys, and engaging in high-level security and intelligence cooperation with Syrian officials. The argument advanced by these regional actors was that complete isolation had failed to produce political reform and instead left Syria deeply vulnerable to external influences and economic collapse. Proponents of re-engagement argued that constructive diplomatic interaction, economic integration, and the gradual return of Arab investment could offer a pathway to moderate regional tensions and encourage the Syrian government to address critical issues such as refugee returns and regional security. A major milestone in this diplomatic rehabilitation occurred when Arab League member states voted to reinstate Syria's membership, allowing Bashar al-Assad to physically return to the regional summit stage. Stepping off the plane at regional summits, Assad projected an image of quiet confidence and vindication. For the Syrian leadership, these diplomatic openings were interpreted as proof that the international conspiracy to unseat the government had failed and that regional pragmatism had ultimately superseded ideological hostility. The normalization process provided the regime with vital psychological and diplomatic breathing room, signaling to domestic audiences and international observers alike that the era of complete regional ostracization was coming to an end. Nevertheless, this diplomatic outreach remained uneven and heavily conditioned. While certain regional countries moved swiftly to restore economic ties and diplomatic representation, other nations maintained strict skepticism, demanding concrete actions regarding political prisoners, human rights accountability, and genuine reconciliation before fully embracing normalization. Furthermore, Western economic sanctions continue to cast a long shadow over any large-scale regional investment or reconstruction efforts, ensuring that international financial institutions and major international corporations remained legally barred from operating inside government-held Syria. In international forums and diplomatic briefings, Syrian officials skillfully utilized the language of sovereignty, counterterrorism, and humanitarian need to challenge Western narratives. They repeatedly pointed to the devastating impact of economic sanctions on ordinary citizens, arguing that Western restrictions were punishing the very population they claimed to protect and hindering basic humanitarian recovery. International aid organizations and United Nations agencies frequently echoed concerns regarding the severe humanitarian toll of economic isolation, though disagreements persisted over the distribution of aid, transparency, and government control over humanitarian corridors. Thus, Bashar al-Assad's position in the international spotlight reflected a deeply divided global landscape. In Western capitals, he remained an isolated dictator subjected to comprehensive sanctions and profound diplomatic condemnation. Yet, across parts of the Middle East and among key allied nations, he was increasingly treated as a surviving head of state with whom pragmatic engagement was deemed necessary. This dual reality allowed the Assad government to endure the diplomatic storm, chipping away at its international isolation, one regional capital at a time, while firmly retaining its grip on power within a fractured and recovering Syria. The long shadow of Bashar al-Assad stretches far beyond the presidential palace in Damascus, defining an era of profound tragedy, geopolitical maneuvering, and political survival. After more than 2 decades at the center of Syrian politics, his legacy is not merely that of an individual leader, but of an entire governing apparatus that chose total destruction over abdication. When historians analyze the trajectory of modern Syria, they confront a narrative of extraordinary devastation, where a state was systematically fractured, its cities hollowed out, and its population scattered across the globe, all to preserve a single dynastic regime. Yet, alongside the vast human cost stands the stark political reality of his survival, presenting a chilling study in authoritarian resilience, foreign patronage, and the limits of international intervention. To understand the legacy of Bashar al-Assad, one must first look at the sheer scale of the transformation that Syria underwent during his tenure. When he inherited power from his father in the summer of 2000, Syria was a tightly controlled but stable nation with functioning institutions, an intact infrastructure, and a society that, while suppressed, was largely spared the horrors of total industrial warfare. 15 years later, after the eruption of the 2011 Uprising and its violent descent into civil war, large swaths of the country resembled post-apocalyptic landscapes. Historic urban centers like Aleppo, Homs, and the outskirts of Damascus were reduced to fields of jagged concrete and pulverized stone. Neighborhoods that had echoed with centuries of commercial and cultural life became silent monuments to artillery bombardments and urban sieges. This destruction was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was the deliberate military doctrine of a regime determined to crush opposition by making life within rebellious areas completely untenable. The human displacement caused by this strategy created one of the most severe refugee crises in modern history. More than half of Syria's pre-war population was forcefully uprooted from their homes. Millions fled across international borders into neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq, while millions more sought asylum in Europe, fundamentally altering political dynamics across the Mediterranean and reshaping demographic realities for generations to come. Inside Syria, internally displaced persons crowded into makeshift camps, abandoned schools, and unfinished buildings, facing freezing winters and scorching summers without adequate shelter, clean water, or medical care. For these millions of citizens, the legacy of Assad is etched in missing family members, destroyed livelihoods, lost generations of education, and an enduring grief that no political settlement can ever truly heal. Economically, the country was pushed back decades. The Syrian pound suffered catastrophic devaluation, inflation soared to unimaginable heights, and basic commodities such as fuel, electricity, bread, and medicine became scarce luxuries for the average citizen. While a tiny circle of regime-connected oligarchs, war profiteers, and militia commanders amassed immense fortunes through smuggling, state contracts, and humanitarian aid diversion, The vast majority of the population was plunged into extreme poverty. The social contract that had existed under Hafez al-Assad, where citizens traded political freedom for economic security, subsidized goods, and social stability, was completely shattered. In its place arose a predatory war economy, where survival depended entirely on remittances from relatives abroad, loyalty to armed networks, or sheer endurance in the face of systemic deprivation. Politically, the survival of the Assad system demonstrated the formidable durability of a deeply entrenched authoritarian state backed by powerful external allies. Unlike other authoritarian leaders targeted during the Arab Spring waves in Tunisia, Egypt, or Libya, Bashar al-Assad retained the absolute loyalty of the military corps, the security apparatus, and key minority communities who feared the alternative posed by sectarian extremists. By framing the entire national uprising as a foreign-backed terrorist conspiracy from day one, the regime successfully mobilized its base, consolidated its inner circle, and justified the most extreme methods of suppression. The state that emerged from the ruins was not the reformist, modernizing entity that some naive observers had envisioned in 2000, but a heavily militarized, dependent patron state where real sovereignty was increasingly shared with, and sometimes subordinated to, foreign powers like Russia and Iran. This foreign entanglement represents another critical pillar of Assad's legacy. By inviting direct military intervention from Moscow and Tehran, the Syrian president ensured his military survival at the steep price of national independence. Russian air power turned the tide of the battlefield, while Iranian-backed militias provided indispensable ground forces. Consequently, post-war Syria found its strategic assets, economic resources, and political decisions heavily influenced, if not dictated, by foreign capitals. Major infrastructure contracts, phosphate mines, oil fields, and military bases were leased or signed away to foreign allies as compensation for their military and financial rescue. The leader who consistently proclaimed himself the ultimate defender of Syrian sovereignty ended up presiding over a fragmented country where foreign flags flew alongside the national banner and external interests dictated local realities. For the wider Middle East, the long shadow of Assad's survival cast profound geopolitical ripples. The conflict transformed Syria into a primary arena for regional proxy competitions, sectarian mobilization, and international drug trafficking, particularly through the mass industrial production and smuggling of captagon pills across regional borders. The normalization processes pursued by several Arab states in later years did not erase the reality of what had occurred. Rather, they underscored a cynical regional pragmatism that prioritized border security, drug containment, and the reduction of Iranian or Turkish overreach above human rights accountability or justice for Syrian victims. This diplomatic rehabilitation sent a chilling message to populations across the region that a dictator could wage industrial-scale war against his own people, employ chemical weapons, displace half the nation, and still ultimately reclaim his seat at the regional table through sheer stubbornness and foreign backing. Yet, despite this diplomatic maneuvering and the physical consolidation of territorial control, the victory claimed by the Assad government was Pyrrhic and deeply fragile. The regime inherited a graveyard. It ruled over a population traumatized, impoverished, and deeply distrustful of state institutions. The structural grievances that sparked the 2011 revolution, rampant corruption, lack of freedom, economic inequality, and brutal security repression, were not resolved. They were simply suppressed by brute force and frozen in time. The underlying tensions remained simmered beneath the surface, waiting in a nation where young people saw no future. Professionals continued to emigrate in droves, and local grievances frequently erupted into localized unrest, even in areas nominally pacified by security forces. In the broader context of 21st century history, Bashar al-Assad's legacy will be studied as a masterclass in the survival of tyranny in the digital age. It demonstrated how an autocratic regime, unconstrained by moral boundaries or international law, could utilize total violence, sectarian manipulation, media disinformation, and strategic foreign alliances to outlast an entire global coalition dedicated to its removal. It revealed the tragic limitations of international humanitarian norms, the paralysis of global diplomatic bodies like the United Nations Security Council, and the willingness of international powers to look away from mass atrocities when strategic interests dictated realpolitik. As the long shadow of Assad's rule extends into the future, Syria remains a nation caught between the ghosts of its devastating past and the bleak stagnation of its present. The dictator who burned a nation to save his crown succeeded in preserving his seat of power, but the throne rests upon ashes, rubble, and the collective trauma of millions. His name will forever be synonymous with one of the darkest chapters of modern history, a stark reminder of the catastrophic price a society can pay when absolute power is concentrated in the hands of a ruler willing to sacrifice everything to retain it. The journey of Bashar al-Assad from a quiet eye clinic in London to the fortified presidential palace in Damascus is one of the most remarkable and tragic political transformations of modern history. When we look back at the man behind the presidency, we see a complex figure shaped by unexpected tragedy, family expectations, and the brutal realities of authoritarian power. He was never meant to rule. While his older brother Basil was groomed from childhood to take over the mantle of power from their father, Heir al-Assad, Bashar lived a quiet life focused on medicine, technology, and ophthalmology. He wore soft-spoken glasses, lived abroad, and showed little interest in the ruthless world of Middle Eastern politics. Yet history does not always follow our plans. The sudden and tragic death of Basil in a car crash in 1994 abruptly shattered Bashar's quiet professional life in London. Pulled back to Damascus by family duty and the calculations of the ruling elite, he was thrust into a world for which he had no natural preparation or personal desire. The transition from doctor to dictator was swift and carefully managed by the old guard of the Ba'ath Party and military intelligence. They needed a family name to preserve their privileges and maintain stability, and Bashar was the only viable option available. When Heir al-Assad died in 2000, the regime quickly amended the constitution to lower the presidential age requirement, clearing the path for Bashar to step onto the political stage. In the early years of his presidency, many observers inside Syria and abroad projected their own hopes onto the young leader. Raised in the West and married to a British-born Syrian investment banker, Esma al-Akraz, Bashar was often portrayed as a modern technocrat who would bring economic reforms, technological advancement, and a gentler touch to Syrian governance. The brief period known as the Damascus Spring offered a tantalizing glimpse of what could have been, as intellectuals, reformers, and ordinary citizens gathered in salons to discuss political freedom and civic participation. But these hopeful expectations collided harshly with the deep-seated reality of the Syrian security state. The old guard, entrenched security chiefs, and family networks held the true levers of power, and Bashar ultimately chose to align himself with the mechanisms of control rather than risk dismantling them. As time went on, the quiet ophthalmologist transformed into a resolute autocrat. He consolidated his authority through a delicate web of family connections, loyal military commanders, intelligence services, and business oligarchs who benefited from state patronage. When mounting social pressures, rural hardship, corruption, and the historic drought of the 2000s pushed the Syrian population to the edge, the regime proved incapable and unwilling to reform. Instead of opening doors to dialogue, when the Arab Spring reached Syrian streets in 2011, the government responded with mass arrests, heavy-handed security crackdowns, and lethal force against peaceful demonstrators in Daraa and other cities. The choices Bashar made during the early months of the uprising sealed his fate and the fate of his country. By framing every protest, grievance, and call for freedom as a foreign-backed terrorist conspiracy, he committed his administration to total confrontation. The peaceful protests quickly escalated into an armed rebellion, drawing in regional and global powers, transforming Syria into a devastating multi-sided civil war. Throughout the years of conflict, as cities were reduced to rubble and millions of citizens fled across borders or became internally displaced, Assad remained insulated within his palace circle, directing a military strategy that prioritized absolute regime survival above all else. His survival was ultimately guaranteed not by popular support or domestic legitimacy, but by the decisive military intervention of foreign allies. Iran, Hezbollah, and later Russia provided the air power, ground forces, and financial lifelines that reversed the tide of the war and allowed government forces to recapture key strongholds like Aleppo. Yet this survival came at an astronomical cost. The country he preserved was shattered, its economy broken, and its true national sovereignty compromised by the very foreign powers that saved him from defeat. He presided over a Pyrrhic victory, ruling over a traumatized population and a landscape of ruins. Reflecting on the man behind the presidency, one sees a chilling paradox. Bashar al-Assad often projected an image of calm, modern detachment, refusing to fit the traditional stereotype of the loud, bombastic Middle Eastern dictator. Yet beneath that quiet exterior lay a rigid, unyielding commitment to absolute power. He demonstrated a cold willingness to watch an entire nation burn rather than share or surrender authority. His decisions shaped one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century, leaving behind a legacy of profound grief, physical destruction, and a divided society. As Syria moves forward into an uncertain and difficult future, the long shadow of Bashar al-Assad will continue to loom large. He stands as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked hereditary rule and the catastrophic consequences that occur when a leader places personal survival above the lives and well-being of his own people. The quiet doctor from London who became the dictator of Damascus left an indelible mark on history, proving that tyranny